The apron hit Margaret high on the chest before sliding down into her hands, leaving a damp streak of tomato sauce across the front of her blouse. For 1 second, nobody moved. Daniel's dining room had been noisy only moments earlier. Plates passing, glasses clinking, his cousins arguing about football, but now every face seemed fixed on my wife. Lauren stood beside the kitchen island, breathing hard. "I asked you to leave it alone," she said. Margaret looked at the dirty apron in her hands. "You asked me to help with dinner, not take over my kitchen." I had been watching Margaret work for most of the afternoon. Lauren had asked her to check the roast, finish the salad, warm the bread, and keep an eye on 2 dishes while she greeted guests. Margaret had done exactly that. The problem started when one serving tray came out later than Lauren wanted. Margaret tried to explain that the oven had already been full. Lauren cut her off. "You always have an excuse." Margaret's face changed then, not angry, just tired. "Lauren, I'm not trying to make this difficult." Lauren grabbed the apron from the counter and threw it. That was the moment I looked at Daniel. I expected him to stand up. I expected him to say something, anything, about the way his wife had just treated his mother in front of a room full of people. Instead, he rubbed his forehead and stared at Margaret. "Mom, you've embarrassed me." Margaret went completely still. I think that sentence hurt her more than the apron ever could. She looked around the table once, as if checking whether she had somehow missed the part where she had become the problem. Then she folded the dirty apron carefully, once down the middle, and placed it on the kitchen counter. "All right," she said. I stood. "Margaret, get your coat." Daniel looked at me. "Dad, come on. Don't make this bigger." "I'm not making anything bigger." My voice stayed quiet. "We're leaving." Margaret did not argue. That worried me more than if she had shouted. She picked up her purse, thanked no one, blamed no one, and walked beside me to the door. Behind us, the room stayed silent. On the drive home, I kept both hands on the wheel because I was angry enough to need somewhere to put them. Margaret watched the streetlights pass across the window. Several minutes went by before she spoke. Maybe I really have been helping too much. I turned toward her for half a second. She was not crying. Somehow that made the sentence worse. Until that night, I had thought the problem was one ugly moment in a kitchen. I was beginning to wonder how many smaller moments I had failed to notice. Margaret barely spoke after we got home. She changed her blouse, washed the small smear of sauce from the fabric, and sat at our kitchen table with both hands around a cup of tea she never drank. I sat across from her. "Was this the first time Lauren talked to you like that?" Margaret looked down. "Not exactly." That answer bothered me, but I did not push. "What hurt the most tonight?" She gave a small, exhausted laugh. "Not the apron. I already knew." "Daniel." She nodded. "He watched it happen, and somehow I was the embarrassment." The next morning, my phone began buzzing before breakfast. A cousin who had been at dinner asked whether Margaret was all right, but the wording of the message told me another version of the evening was already circulating. By noon, 2 more relatives had contacted us. Apparently, Margaret had criticized Lauren in her own kitchen, refused to respect her wishes, created a scene when Lauren became frustrated, and then stormed out when Daniel tried to calm everyone down. Margaret read one message over my shoulder and handed the phone back. "I don't want to argue with people." "You didn't storm out." "I know. Lauren threw an apron at you." "I know that too." Her calmness made me angrier than any argument could have. Daniel called that afternoon. I answered in the living room while Margaret stayed in the kitchen. "Dad, can you talk to Mom?" he asked. "About what?" "About letting this go." I waited. "Is Lauren sorry for throwing that apron at her?" There was a pause. "Dad, it wasn't like that." I was standing there. Lauren was frustrated. Mom kept interfering after Lauren told her to stop. "Your mother was doing the work Lauren asked her to do." Daniel sighed. "This is exactly what I mean. Everybody was uncomfortable, and now Mom's making it into some huge family issue." I looked toward the kitchen doorway. Margaret could hear him. She lowered her eyes. "Daniel, I'm going to give you one chance to say something simple. Throwing that apron at your mother was wrong." Another pause. "I'm not choosing sides between my wife and Mom." That told me more than he intended. "Fine. Then your mother won't put you in that position." What does that mean? It means she won't be coming over to cook. She won't clean up after gatherings. She won't shop for you, prepare meals, handle pickups, or babysit until she decides she wants to again. His reaction was immediate. "Dad, that's ridiculous." "Why?" "Because we depend on her for some of that stuff." I said nothing. He seemed to hear his own words a second too late. I mean, she always helps. Helping isn't the same as owing you. So this is punishment? No. It's a boundary. His voice tightened. What are we supposed to do now? I looked at Margaret. She had heard every word. For years, I had thought keeping peace meant not making family disagreements worse. Sitting there with the phone against my ear, I began to understand how easily silence could become permission. Daniel, I said, you're supposed to handle your own home. For the next several days, Margaret did exactly what I had told Daniel she would do. Nothing. That sounds harsher than it was. She did not block anyone's number, send angry messages, or announce some family boycott. She simply stopped arranging her life around Daniel and Lauren's household. The first sign that this mattered came 3 days later, when Daniel called Margaret during dinner. I could hear only her side at first. No, I can't do the pickup tomorrow. She listened. I understand, but I already have plans. Another pause. Daniel, you'll have to work something out. When she hung up, she stared at her plate. He needed me to pick up the kids. And you have plans. I do. She took another bite, but I could see the guilt on her face. A few days later, Lauren canceled a family meal she had planned because she could not get everything ready after work. One of Daniel's relatives mentioned it, casually on the phone, sounding surprised. I thought Lauren loved hosting. I almost corrected that assumption, then stopped. Margaret had never complained about how much preparation she did, and I was not going to start speaking for her now. The following week brought another scramble over a pickup Daniel had apparently assumed Margaret could handle. Nobody was in danger. Daniel rearranged his schedule and managed it himself. But each inconvenience showed me something I should have noticed much earlier. Margaret had not been stepping in occasionally. Their routines had been built with the expectation that she would be available. One evening, I came into our kitchen and found her standing over a large container of soup. Beside it were smaller containers lined up on the counter. That's a lot of soup, I said. She looked at the containers, then gave me a sheepish smile. I made too much. We both knew that was not true. For years, whenever she cooked something Daniel liked, half of it seemed to find its way to his house. Her hand rested on one of the lids. The kids like this. I know. She was quiet for a moment, then began putting the smaller containers back into our refrigerator. This is the part one hate. What part? I don't want the children thinking I'm staying away from them because I'm angry. There was the cost of the boundary. It was easy for me to say Daniel and Lauren should manage their own household. Margaret was the one who missed the grandchildren. 2 nights later, Daniel called her again. This time she put the phone on speaker because she was folding laundry and did not want to stop. Mom, could you come by Saturday morning? He asked. Margaret glanced at me. Why? Lauren has work. I have a few things I need to get done, and we could really use you for a couple of hours. Maybe you could bring something for lunch too. Margaret folded another towel. Have you thought any more about what happened at dinner? Silence. Then Daniel said, Mom, can we not do this every time I ask for something? Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I'm not doing anything, Daniel. That's the point. We're having trouble keeping everything straight right now. He began listing the things that had become difficult: pickups, meals, weekend errands, getting ready when relatives came over. Listening to him, I felt something shift inside me. He was describing his mother's contribution without realizing he was doing it. I'm sorry you're having a difficult week, Margaret said. But I'm not coming Saturday. After the call, she went upstairs. I stayed at the kitchen table longer than I meant to. Eventually, I reached for the wall calendar because I needed to check an appointment. Flipping backward, I noticed Daniel's initials. Then I saw them again. And again. Pickups, dinner, kids, groceries. Short notes in Margaret's handwriting spread across month after month. I stood there with the calendar open in my hands, wondering how often I had driven my wife across town, waited for her to come home, or eaten dinner alone without ever asking why helping our son required so much of her time. The calendar stayed on the table until Margaret came downstairs the next morning. I had marked nothing and moved nothing. I simply opened it to the same stretch of months and turned it toward her. I never realized how often you were over there. Margaret glanced at the pages. It was a busy time for them. For nearly a year? She pulled out a chair. What are you doing? Trying to understand. Years of running a small service business had given me one habit Margaret occasionally teased me about. I kept records. Not because I suspected anyone, but because forgotten details had a way of becoming expensive details. Receipts went into monthly folders. Appointments stayed on calendars. If I paid for something that needed tracking, I could usually reconstruct when and why. The calendar gave me dates. The folders gave me something else. I started finding grocery receipts from days marked with Daniel's initials. At first, that proved very little. We bought groceries too. Then I noticed quantities we would never use ourselves. Extra milk, children's snacks, larger packages of meat, lunch supplies. The pattern repeated. Margaret watched me place several receipts beside the calendar. Please don't turn this into an audit. I'm not. It looks like one. Then tell me what I'm looking at. She sat across from me and slowly ran a finger along one of the dates. Daniel and Lauren were having a difficult stretch. She explained that childcare costs had increased at the same time Lauren was under pressure at work. Their schedules kept colliding, and Daniel had been embarrassed by how often they needed help. Margaret started filling gaps. She picked up the children when she could. She brought meals so nobody had to cook after a long day. If she was already shopping, she sometimes bought what their household needed. Small things. Ordinary things. Things that disappeared almost as soon as they were used. How long? I asked. Longer than I intended. I looked at the calendar again. This wasn't temporary. It started that way. I found more than groceries as we talked. Small household necessities mixed into ordinary purchases, fuel from repeated trips, notes about pickups and meals. None of it amounted to some dramatic secret fortune. That was what struck me. It was the repetition. A bag of groceries here. 3 hours there. Dinner on a Wednesday. A pickup on Friday. Another Saturday rearranged because Daniel needed someone. Why didn't he know how much you were doing? I asked. Margaret looked genuinely surprised. He knew I helped. That isn't what I asked. She folded her hands. Because I didn't want them keeping score. You mean you didn't want them feeling indebted? She nodded. They were already struggling. Daniel hated admitting it. I wanted them to feel like they were managing their own life, not like his parents were holding them together. I leaned back. The very thing Margaret had done to protect their dignity had made her contribution almost invisible. She reached across the table and gathered the receipts into one pile. I don't want these waved in anyone's face. I'm not planning to. Good. I helped because they're our family. Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was one of the relatives who had been around Daniel and Lauren often during that period. We talked briefly about something unrelated before the conversation drifted toward the tension in the family. Then came a casual sentence that made me sit straighter. Margaret was always like that, the relative said. Remember when she made us promise not to tell Daniel how often she was covering things for them? She didn't want him embarrassed. I looked across the table at my wife. Margaret had heard enough from my expression to know something had changed. The calendar had shown me what she did. That phone call suggested there were other people who knew why she had kept it quiet. After I ended the call, Margaret asked, "What did they say?" I told her exactly what I had heard. She sighed and looked toward the stack of receipts. I asked people not to talk about that. Why them too? Because sometimes they noticed. That afternoon, I called the relative back. I was careful not to suggest an answer. I asked what they remembered about that period and let them talk. The picture they gave me matched the calendar more closely than I expected. Margaret had rearranged appointments when Daniel needed help with the children. She had canceled personal plans more than once. She brought meals on weeks when Daniel and Lauren's schedules were especially difficult, and occasionally picked up small household necessities without mentioning the cost. None of it was extraordinary by itself. Together, it formed a pattern. She never wanted credit, the relative said. Actually, she wanted the opposite. Daniel was embarrassed that things were so difficult. Margaret told us not to make him feel like everyone knew. I looked across the room at my wife. She was pretending to read, but I knew she was listening. Did Daniel know people had noticed? I asked. Not from me. Margaret made that very clear. There was one more thing. Over time, Lauren's description of Margaret's involvement had apparently changed. At first, she sounded grateful. Later, she began saying Margaret liked being involved because she had plenty of time and enjoyed feeling needed. The relative had never thought much about it until now. After the call, I repeated that part to Margaret. She looked away. Did you know Lauren was saying that? I heard something similar once. And you said nothing? What was I supposed to say? That she should be more grateful. Margaret shook her head. That would have made every meal and every hour with the kids sound like a bill waiting to be collected. I understood then why the receipts bothered her. To me, they documented a reality Daniel seemed determined not to see. To Margaret, they threatened to turn love into a transaction. I wanted to call our son immediately. I wanted to tell him exactly how many times his mother had rearranged her life while he was busy protecting himself from embarrassment. Margaret stopped me before I reached for the phone. No, he needs to know. Maybe, but not like that. Lauren is telling people you interfere because you need to feel useful. Then Lauren can say what she wants. And everyone is supposed to believe it? Margaret's expression hardened slightly. I did those things for Daniel and the children because I chose to. I'm not going to humiliate him now just because he humiliated me. That silenced me. Her restraint was not weakness. It was a boundary I had to respect too. So when I spoke to Daniel later, I did not mention receipts, calendars, or what the relative had confirmed. I asked him one question. Do you still believe your mother was the problem that night? He exhaled heavily. Dad, we've been through this. That isn't an answer. Lauren thinks Mom owes her an apology. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. For what? For not respecting her boundaries in her own house, and then making everyone uncomfortable. Your wife threw something at your mother. It was an apron, Dad. And your mother is supposed to apologize? Daniel's voice became impatient. If she would just acknowledge her part, everybody could move on. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand. Until then, part of me had hoped this was still a badly handled argument that pride was keeping alive. But Daniel was no longer asking for peace. He was asking his mother to endorse a version of the night that made her responsible for her own humiliation. And Margaret's silence, meant to protect his dignity, was giving that version room to grow. The next family gathering was supposed to be 2 weekends later. Under ordinary circumstances, Margaret would have spent part of the week deciding what to cook and asking whether Daniel needed anything brought over. This time, she made no plans. Then Daniel called me. Dad, are you and Mom coming Saturday? That depends. On what? Whether your mother is actually welcome. He hesitated. Of course she's welcome. I waited, because I could hear the condition coming. Lauren just thinks it would be better if Mom talked to her first. Talked about what? Apologized. Privately. Then we can put all this behind us. I looked across the room at Margaret. She could tell from my face exactly where the conversation was going. So your mother can attend a family gathering if she apologizes to the woman who threw an apron at her. Dad, stop saying it like that. How should I say it? Daniel lowered his voice. Lauren feels disrespected too. Your mother isn't apologizing for being humiliated. Then I don't know what you want me to do. After the call, I told Margaret everything. She sat quietly for a long moment. You should still go if you want to. Without you, I don't want you choosing between me and Daniel. I'm not choosing. I'm deciding where I want to be. Her eyes filled, though she blinked the tears away. I miss the kids. That was the part Daniel did not seem to understand. Refusing to return to the old arrangement was not easy for Margaret. Every boundary she held cost her time with people she loved. Over the next few days, the family version of events hardened. Lauren told relatives Margaret had stopped helping with meals and the children to pressure them into taking her side. The accusation reached us through more than one conversation. Some relatives were uncomfortable with Lauren's behavior, but had begun describing the situation as 2 women who were both too stubborn to apologize. That bothered Margaret more than she wanted to admit. I never threatened them with anything, she said one evening. I just stopped doing things they apparently didn't think mattered. I thought about the calendar and the receipts. We had enough to show that her help had been substantial. I also had a relative willing to confirm why Margaret had kept so much of it quiet. For the first time, I understood the trap clearly. If we said nothing, Lauren's version could become the story everyone remembered. If we showed everything, we would expose a period of Daniel and Lauren's life Margaret had deliberately protected. Let me correct them, I said. Margaret shook her head. Not with all of that. Then what happens when they keep saying you're using your help as leverage? I don't know. She looked exhausted. But I won't turn every grocery bag and every afternoon with my grandchildren into evidence that somebody owes me gratitude. I could respect that and still hate what silence was costing her. For years, I had treated keeping peace as a virtue. Now I could see the difference between refusing to create conflict and allowing someone else to control the truth. Still, this was Margaret's story before it was mine. I could not defend her dignity by ignoring her wishes. So I asked, what do you want me to do if Lauren says it again in front of everyone? Margaret considered that carefully. Tell the truth about what happened that night. And everything before it. Not unless I say so. I nodded. All right. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Promise me. I promise. That promise left us in an uncomfortable place. Lauren was becoming more confident because nobody had challenged the larger story. Daniel seemed convinced that if he waited long enough, his mother would surrender rather than remain separated from the family. And Margaret was protecting the same people who were accusing her of weaponizing the help she had never wanted anyone to count. For the moment, we had the truth sitting quietly in folders and calendars inside our house. Whether it stayed there was no longer going to be my decision. The decision stopped being theoretical 3 days later. Margaret received a call from a relative who sounded more confused than judgmental. Afterward, she sat at the kitchen table without speaking. What happened? I asked. Lauren told them I stopped helping because I wanted to punish her. I waited. Margaret looked toward the calendar we had put away. She said I'm trying to make them struggle so. Daniel will force her to apologize. That accusation reached somewhere the others had not. Margaret could tolerate being called intrusive. She could even tolerate people misunderstanding why she had stepped back. But she had spent months protecting Daniel and Lauren from exactly the kind of embarrassment Lauren was now accusing her of exploiting. I won't let that become the truth, she said. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a long time. If she says it again, you can correct her. With the records? Margaret nodded, then immediately added, only what's necessary. No totals. No list of every favor. I don't want Daniel sitting there while everyone hears every time we bought groceries or every time I changed my plans because they needed me. And the relative who remembers what you asked them? If they're willing to speak for themselves, yes. That night, we went through the material together. We chose several calendar entries that showed the pattern, a few representative receipts, nothing more. Margaret rejected anything that felt like humiliation rather than clarification. The point was not to prove Daniel and Lauren could not manage their lives. It was to establish that help freely given had gradually been treated as something owed. Before the gathering, I called Daniel one last time. I'm telling you this because I don't want you surprised, I said. If Lauren tells the family again that your mother withheld help to punish you, I will correct that statement. With what? The truth. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Dad, this is getting ridiculous. Then stop it before Saturday. Mom could stop it with one apology. There it was again, another open door he chose not to walk through. All right, I said, but don't say you weren't warned. Saturday arrived with none of the usual preparation from Margaret. We went together, carrying no casserole, no serving dishes, no bag of things somebody had forgotten to buy. I brought the calendar and the few receipts we had selected in a plain folder. Margaret knew they were there. Nobody else did. The gathering was polite at first, the kind of politeness that makes every ordinary sentence feel rehearsed. Margaret spoke warmly to the grandchildren and kept her distance from Lauren. Daniel seemed relieved enough that I wondered whether he believed our presence meant Margaret had finally surrendered. Then someone mentioned the canceled family meal from the previous week. Lauren gave a small sigh. Things have been difficult since Margaret decided to stop helping. Margaret's shoulders tightened. I said nothing yet. Lauren continued. I understand she was upset, but using childcare and family help to make a point has gone too far. A relative shifted uncomfortably. Another looked at Margaret, waiting. Daniel stared at the table. He knew what I had told him. He still said nothing. Margaret answered calmly. That isn't why I stopped. Lauren shook her head. You stopped the moment I asked you to respect boundaries in my house. The room became very quiet. Lauren, I said, you should leave it there. She looked directly at me. Why? Everyone keeps acting like I did something terrible because I finally told her she couldn't run my home. For a moment, the version she had repeated for weeks seemed to settle over the room as fact. Margaret interfered. Lauren finally objected. Margaret retaliated by withdrawing help. Margaret looked around at people who had eaten her food, watched her rearrange her days, and never known why. Her face was pale, but steady. This was exactly what she had feared. Having a vulnerable period in her son's life exposed because someone else had rewritten her kindness as control. I did not reach for the folder. Not yet. I looked at her instead. The choice still belonged to her. Margaret held my eyes for a second, then gave one small nod. I opened the folder, took out the calendar, and placed it on the table. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I opened the calendar to the pages Margaret and I had selected. Before anyone decides why Margaret stopped helping, I said, we should be clear about what that help actually was. Lauren leaned back. Nobody said she never helped. Then let's start there. I pointed to several entries in Margaret's handwriting. Pickups, meals, groceries, afternoons with the children, days when her own plans had been moved. Because Daniel and Lauren needed someone. I did not read every entry. I did not need to. The pattern was visible. Then I placed 3 receipts beside the calendar. These are examples, not a bill. Margaret does not want repayment, and she never did. Lauren glanced at them. She chose to do those things. Yes, I said. She did. Lauren seemed almost relieved. Exactly. And choosing to help is what makes it help. It doesn't make her your employee, and it doesn't make that help something you're entitled to. Daniel finally looked at the calendar. His expression had changed. He recognized the dates. Mom, why did you keep all this? I didn't, Margaret said. Your father keeps records. I kept a calendar. But why are we doing this now? Margaret looked at him. Because your wife told people I stopped helping to punish you. Before Daniel could respond, the relative I had spoken with earlier cleared their throat. That isn't how I remember it. Everyone turned. They explained, without exaggeration, that Margaret had asked people not to discuss how often she was filling gaps for Daniel and Lauren during that difficult period. She had been especially concerned that Daniel would feel embarrassed if he thought the family knew they were struggling. Daniel stared at his mother. You told people not to tell me? I didn't want you feeling watched or judged. The room shifted in a way I could almost feel. The same silence that had protected Lauren's version now worked against it. Lauren folded her arms. None of this changes what happened in my kitchen. She kept interfering after I asked her to stop. No, I said. That is the other thing we need to get straight. One of the people who had been there that night spoke before I could continue. Lauren, you asked Margaret to help with dinner. I heard you ask her to check the roast and finish the salad. Another voice added quietly. And you threw the apron before Margaret left. Lauren's face reddened. I was frustrated. She was making me look incompetent in my own house. Margaret's expression tightened, but she remained seated. I looked at Daniel. You were there. Did your mother shout at Lauren? No. Did she throw anything? No. Did she storm out before Lauren threw the apron? He looked down. No. Lauren turned toward him. Daniel, no. He repeated, quieter this time. I did not need another receipt. I did not need to calculate what Margaret's time had been worth. The central lie had collapsed. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. When he looked up again, he was looking at his mother rather than me. I knew you hadn't started it. Margaret said nothing. That night, he continued, everybody was staring. Lauren was upset. You were standing there, and I just wanted it to stop. His voice broke slightly. I thought if I told you to let it go, you would. Margaret's eyes filled. Because I'm your mother. Daniel nodded. Because I knew you'd forgive me. There it was, the part no document could have shown. He had chosen the safest person in the room to hurt because he trusted her love more than he respected its limits. Mom, I'm sorry. Margaret let the words sit between them. I believe you're sorry right now, she said. But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. Daniel swallowed. I understand. Lauren looked from him to Margaret, then around the table. For the first time, nobody rushed to rescue her from the discomfort. Margaret did not demand an apology. I did not demand punishment. The consequence was already there. The help they had treated as permanent was no longer guaranteed, and the trust beneath it had been damaged. Daniel leaned forward. Can I come see you tomorrow? Just me. Margaret looked tired, more than triumphant. There was no victory in her face, only the relief of no longer being asked to carry a lie along with everything else she had carried. Not tonight, she said. Call me tomorrow. Then she closed the calendar and slid it back toward me. The evidence had done what it needed to do. Nothing more. Daniel did call the next day. He asked Margaret if he could come over, and when he arrived, he came alone. For once, he did not bring a problem that needed solving. He did not ask her to watch the children, prepare a meal, or help him straighten out the week ahead. He sat at our kitchen table and apologized for one specific thing before anything else. I should never have said you embarrassed me. Margaret listened without interrupting. Daniel admitted that he had seen exactly what happened that night and had chosen the response he thought would end the scene fastest. He had expected his mother to absorb the hurt because that was what she had always done, made difficult things easier for everyone else. I treated that like it was something you owed me, he said. Margaret did not tell him everything was fine. She told him she loved him. She also told him love was not an agreement to return to the old arrangement. Daniel accepted that. What mattered afterward was that he began acting like he meant it. He visited without arriving with a list of things he needed. When childcare became complicated, he and Lauren worked it out themselves. Their meals, errands, schedules, and family gatherings became their responsibility again. Margaret still missed the grandchildren, but slowly she began seeing them regularly under different terms. A visit with Grandma was a visit with Grandma. It did not automatically become an afternoon of cooking, cleaning, pickups, and errands. Lauren took longer. There was no dramatic reconciliation between her and Margaret never asked for one. Eventually, Lauren apologized directly for throwing the apron. Margaret accepted the apology without pretending that one sentence restored the trust that had been damaged. They remained polite and more distant than before. For the time being, that was enough. I had something of my own to admit. One evening, I told Margaret I was sorry for all the times I had mistaken staying out of things for keeping peace. I had watched her rearrange our days again and again without asking whether generosity had quietly become expectation. "I don't need you fighting every battle for me," she said. "I know. I just need you not to disappear when one matters." I promised I understood the difference now. Several weeks later, we had a small family meal at our house. Nothing elaborate. No performance. No attempt to prove that everything had returned to normal. Daniel helped set the table. The grandchildren carried napkins. And with the seriousness children give to jobs adults barely notice. Margaret finished one dish at the stove while the rest of us handled what remained. I was reaching for serving spoons when I noticed an apron hanging from the hook beside the pantry. Clean. Folded neatly over itself. For a moment, I saw the other one again. The stained fabric hitting Margaret's blouse. The silent room. Our son telling his mother that she was the embarrassment. Then Margaret turned off the stove. She took off the apron she was wearing, hung it beside the other one, and walked to the table. She did not check whether everyone had enough before sitting down. She did not rush back to the kitchen because somebody needed one more thing. Daniel stood and brought the last dish over himself. Margaret took her seat beside me. I looked at her plate. For once, her food was still warm.